To order videotapes using your Visa or MasterCard, or to receive a free Pacific Arts video catalog, call 1-800-538-5856.
The period since the Second World War has seen a transformation of carriers, the planes they carry, and the weaponry they use. The seeds for this rapid development were sown during the war, with much of the change necessitated by one factor, the jet engine. Just after the war, in fact 8 days after, the first major step took place. Carriers got bigger with the launch of the USS Midway. The new ship displaced 45,000 tons in comparison to her immediate predecessors, the Essex class, at 27,000 tons. 6 Midways, a 1942 design, were to have been built, but only 3 were completed. The increase in tonnage was largely accounted for by the addition of an armoured deck. This added weight and slowed the ship, so bigger engines were needed, which required a bit more ship and a bit more armour, which implied still bigger engines, and so on, until a compromise had been agreed at 45,000 tons. Capable of 33 knots, the Midway represented another step upward in the power of the individual carrier. Her initial air arm would be 73 Hellcat or Corsair fighters and 64 Helldivers, planes from the Second World War inventory. But this inventory was going into a state of flux, as naval planes reflected the rush of technical advance stemming from the war. Work was going ahead, of course, on replacement planes. Grumman working on the Bearcat to supersede the Hellcat, and so on. The Bearcat had, however, been overtaken by history. A propeller-driven fighter was now a thing of the past. It would take a few years for this change to take place, but the arrival of the jet and the advances which were to improve its efficiency and useful output had opened up possibilities of speed far beyond the physical limits of a propeller. The war had seen orders placed for a number of new designs, and several prototypes were being tested or were nearing completion at the end of the war. Some reflected new aims for carrier planes. Grumman's F-7F Tigercat was an attempt to produce a plane which could perform all carrier roles. A fast and heavily armed twin-engined fighter which could carry bombs or a torpedo. The design had been ordered in 1941, and delivery started in April 1944. Used by the Marines, these planes were not equipped to be deployed from carriers until after the war, and then only in limited numbers as a night fighter. In some ways, the Tiger Cat did herald things to come. Planes were going to get bigger and heavier and deploy greater individual firepower. However, a prototype that more clearly reflected the future was another Navy fighter, ordered in 1943 and first flown on January the 26th, 1945. This was McDonnell's Phantom, the FH-1. The Phantom made its first takeoff from a carrier in July 1946. As the Navy's first all-jet fighter, this plane's development reflects the rate of advances being made. The Phantom was to have been powered by 6 small jets, but even before construction started, it had been possible to radically simplify the plans to the use of 2 engines. Jet engine improvement was setting new airframe design problems at a very rapid rate. For the Navy, adapting the new jets to shipboard use prompted a number of advances in both. The Phantoms were not deployed as carrier planes. Those delivered were used by the Marines, the first jets to make it into Navy service. They were a fairly conservative design, with straight wings and conventional tail. The Phantom was capable of just under 500 miles an hour, which put it in good company in 1945, but it was soon to be left behind as planes pushed nearer to the sound barrier. The FH-1 can be seen as a purely experimental aircraft. It is a measure of the soundness of its design that it actually went into production at all. As a test plane, it broke a lot of new ground and drew attention to some of the problems that would have to be overcome in adapting jets for carrier use. It is part of the great post-war explosion of aviation. Experimentation in these years was to lead to major advances, not only in power plants, but in construction methods, materials, controls, crew safety, and a myriad of other aspects of aircraft. As a result of experience and experimentation, aircraft have become more complex, more powerful, faster, and safer. Tests, from the first supersonic flights down to ramming old Avengers into a sandbag embankment, have all made their contribution. At the core of the post-war advances in aviation has been the continual refinement of the jet engine, increasing its power and response, decreasing its thrust and weight. The 1,600 pounds of thrust of the engine used in the Phantom had been doubled just over a year later by the engines adopted for McDonnell's next Navy jet, the Banshee. Again a twin-engine design, this was to fly a lot of combat hours in Korea. The rapidity of development of the jets was matched by advances in overall design. To say the least, many aspects of the conventional aircraft shape were incompatible with supersonic speed. Radical new shapes, like Chance Vaught's remarkably modern-looking Cutlass, started to be tested. Types appeared and disappeared rapidly. There was high attrition through accidents and equipment failures, and the Navy was ordering planes in relatively small batches, so they remained in service for only a short time. Over 20 different fighter types were built and tested in the 10 years following the Phantom's introduction in 1947. 12 fighters actually went into production, over one a year. There were continuing development problems with the engines, and McDonnell's 1951 F-3, the Demon, for example, was underpowered. Even so, the shape of the Demon and its speed of 700 miles per hour show the huge leap forward made in the preceding 6 years. While many of these designs were to have short service lives, some were to remain in use for long careers. Chance Vaught's F-8U Crusader stayed in the front line for 20 years. The experimental stage of jet aircraft design to cope with the sound barrier, which had been manifested in the post-war flurry of prototypes, was brief. Major advances since have largely been confined to the incorporation of electronics systems and refinement of design. Even the shapes of variable sweep wing and VTOL aircraft sit easily in the modern design school. The jet planes shared several trends which made them more and more difficult to operate from carriers. They were getting heavier and faster all the time. More importantly, they were requiring higher takeoff and landing speeds and taking a long time at takeoff to achieve liftoff. The increased speed and weight of the planes also had safety considerations. On a carrier, a plane skidding as far as this would have at least hit the barrier, probably going fast enough to tear on through it into any planes parked forward or to career over the ship's bow. The increasing speed of the planes introduced another problem. How do you get a crewman safely out of a damaged plane in supersonic flight? The answer, of course, is that you shoot him clear of the plane and then release his parachute. Today, this is common knowledge. In the late 1940s, it was a real design problem. There was considerable testing to be gone through to answer the many questions posed by the problem of crew safety. What ejection force could the human body stand? What happens to a face when it gets into a 600-mile-an-hour slipstream? What trajectory will a seat follow when shot into the air, and how do you influence that trajectory? If you can get them both out of the plane without colliding with the tail, then how do you keep the pilot and the seat clear of one another? After all, you don't want the seat to clobber the crewman. He has at that point quite clearly got enough on his mind. The ejector seat itself contributes a considerable weight to a plane, showing the compounding effect of post-war developments. One safety problem requires a new design solution for all future types. The answer proves to be quite heavy, so the ground rules for design are changed. In future, all designs will have to accommodate this extra weight. Another example. Supersonic speeds demand changes to wing shapes. This solves the problem of speed ripping the wings off. However, it turns out that it also means higher landing speed. Existing ground or deck systems have to be altered to accommodate this, and so on. A successful development sets a new problem, or in the case of the jet speed, a whole series of problems. Jets have forced major changes on carriers, both in their shape and in their systems. The early 50s were to see the acceptance of three major new developments to deal with jets: the angled deck, the return of the catapult, and the adoption of electronic landing aids to replace the batsman in guiding the pilot onto the deck. The first of these was the angled deck. By the late 40s, the momentum of planes in flight deck accidents was causing major problems. 10,000-pound aircraft crashing at 100 miles per hour were too much for crash barriers to handle, and accidents often ended up with smashed planes and exploding fuel and weapons. The angled flight deck allowed a plane which missed the arrestor hook to simply open throttle and go round again. Quite apart from this crucial improvement, the angled runway released a lot of the scarce flight deck space for use during launch and recovery operations. The Midways and 14 Essex-class ships were to be progressively refitted to incorporate an angled deck. Other structural changes strengthened the decks to handle the massive landing impacts of heavier planes. The load capacity of the lifts had to be upgraded, and they had to be widened. whole new parallel fuel storage and delivery systems and new fire suppression systems were built in. Extra bunkering had to be found for fuel for the high-consumption jets. Another advance was the development of the steam catapult. The use of a catapult is essential to get jet planes into the air off a carrier. In today's terms, an F-14 fully loaded takes about a mile to get off the runway under its own power. On a carrier, the 30-ton plane is catapulted airborne at 170 miles per hour in 300 feet. The big carriers retained in commission have been progressively refitted several times. Additional changes have been made to the systems used. Not the least of these was the elimination of the batsman, whose dancing and cavorting mimicked the attitude of a landing plane and let the pilot know how he was going. Given the speed of jets, there wasn't time for a batsman to assess the situation, signal to the pilot, and have him make corrective action. What happened was the elimination of the middleman, with a system of lights that told the pilot what he needed to know by reference to the bit of carrier he needed to put his plane on. If the light reflecting off the mirror is lined up with the registration lights, then the pilot knows he is on course. Any deviation, and the magnitude of that deviation, will advise him on what response to make. In theory, the mirrors are set for angle and height to suit the plane and the conditions, and the pilot flies his plane down a string of light safely and accurately every time. In this case, theory and practice are not too far apart. It is estimated that the angled deck and the optical landing system have halved the accident rate on United States Navy carriers. The 50s and 60s also saw the first experiments in fully automatic landings, with the ship taking over the controls from the pilot to recover the plane. In 1952, construction started on a new class of ship, the Forrestal's, incorporating all the advances into a new hull. Once again, there was a jump in the size of the ships, an addition of more than 15,000 tons over the midways, to displacement of 60,000 tons. This was primarily because of a requirement to maintain the aircraft capacity. The same number of bigger planes demanded more space. There had been a lot of wrangling over the new ships. There were many who argued that the big carrier, indeed all conventional forces, had been made obsolete by the bomb. In part, therefore, the increased size of the new generation of carriers put forward by the Navy was directed towards giving carriers nuclear attack capacity. In any case, the demands of the jets for space in storage, as well as to land and take off, commanded bigger ships. In the end, the Korean War settled any doubts in Congress, and approval for the construction of the new generation of carriers was readily granted. For the first time in a United States carrier, the flight deck was built as an integral member of the hull structure. As a result, it was strengthened throughout. The ship's flight deck for the first time exceeded 1,000 feet in length, and she was 240 feet wide. To achieve her speed of 33 knots, her 8 boilers delivered 260,000 horsepower. Everything about her was big, and she presented new construction challenges. The methods developed to build the Forrestal's have been the basis for all US carrier construction since. The class was a quantum leap in carrier design. Centerline lifts disappeared completely and were replaced by 4 deck-edge lifts, 1 to port and 3 to starboard. 2 catapults were added to the angled deck, giving the ship 4 and the ability to launch 8 planes a minute. Deck clearance in the hangar was 25 feet, allowing the deployment of much larger aircraft. And, having been built with jets in mind, she had enormous additional fuel storage. Though some of the innovation in her design responded to general experience, most of the changes could be attributed to the arrival of the jets. After more than 2 years in construction, the ship was launched on the 11th of December 1954. There would be another 10 months fitting her out before she was commissioned. Gradually, the ship would come to life. Her boilers were lit for the first time, and she began to supply her own power. The dockyard crews, plumbers, telephone technicians, carpenters, engineers, electricians, and so on, slowly thinned out as they finished their tasks. Specialist crews started to come on board and familiarize themselves with the equipment. Other sailors started training on the ship. Final checks of fitting and equipment were carried out, and signing over of the ship began. On the 1st of October 1955, the USS Forrestal was commissioned and began sea trials in Navy hands. Six Forrestal-class ships were planned, and construction went ahead. Although there were considerable modifications during building, the first 4 ships delivered were all fairly similar. The last 2 were to be so different they are considered to be a separate class of ship. Construction of these 6 took just over 10 years, by which time another 2 of the advanced Forrestals had been laid down. The development of missiles, which has made the delivery of nuclear warheads by aircraft redundant, has not diminished the importance of the carriers. Where once they might have been seen as mobile homes for the missiles, now their worth is accepted even on conventional grounds alone. The United States Defense Department had accepted a need for continuing carrier strength and committed itself to maintaining 15 attack carriers in commission. This commitment has meant that whenever it has been needed, the US has been able to deploy enormous concentrated mobile power, and this factor has been one of immense significance in global affairs. The end of World War II had left the world divided into very arbitrary spheres of influence, and it was to be less than 5 years before regional uncertainties, reflecting increasing global tension, blew up into war, in this instance, in Korea. The Korean conflict rose directly out of the end of World War II. By agreement, the Russians had accepted the Japanese surrender north of the 38th parallel, and the United States had accepted their surrender south of that line. Free elections to democratically reunify the divided nation had fallen through, and 2 governments, both claiming sovereignty to the whole of Korea, had emerged. This stalemate was broken on the 25th of June 1950, when the North Korean army, with Soviet artillery, tanks and tactical aircraft, swept into the south. The United States armed forces were caught off guard in the throes of post-war budget cuts. There was a delay before effective response could be prepared, and the North Korean forces swept all resistance before them. The defenders, reinforced by predominantly American United Nations forces, were pushed into a small pocket around Pusan. As troops were equipped and forces sent to Korea, there was a scramble to replenish the small active arsenal available for the job. General MacArthur, in charge of the Japanese occupation, was put in control of operations in Korea and rushed what forces were available in Japan to the scene. The United Nations foothold at Pusan, ringed by the North Koreans, was held in a bloody battle that saw heavy American casualties, but also drained the North Koreans of their active strength. Stalin had reneged on the north. After supplying arms and training and giving his approval to the invasion plans, he'd withdrawn all Soviet advisors and military personnel before the northern advance. This had left the Korean communists gravely hampered, and though they were able to overrun the badly organized and half-hearted activity of the southern forces, they could not cope with either the US land forces or the swarming carrier-based planes that soon harried their every move. Navy planes were also operating from Pusan itself, flown by Marines. Corsairs, Douglas Sky Raiders, and even the early carrier jets were deployed from the rough and untrustworthy Pusan Strip. Korea is very mountainous, and good terrain for large airfields is limited. This was to be an important factor for the Navy. With the limited range of the fuel-hungry jets, the Air Force found its fighters, flying from Japan, were not able to stay over the battlefield for more than 15 minutes. The essential close ground attack and air cap for the troops would have to be supplied by the carriers, and what planes could be operated from the few UN-held strips in Korea, none of which were suitable for the more temperamental jet types. At home in the US, the Korean War had come as an enormous and unwelcome shock. The impetus to post-war contraction of the armed forces had been strong, and despite the worried grumblings of senior staff in the Defense Department, the nation had been glad to enjoy peace and prosperity. If the Second World War had left the generals with a desire to never have war catch the country unprepared again, it was the Korean conflict that did this for the wider community. The Cold War that continued after the conflict would ensure public support for a continually expanding budget for defense hardware and research. The immediate effect of the outbreak of war was to spur a massive re-equipping of the forces. In 1950, naval aviation was in the throes of a great upheaval, with the lessons of the Second World War and the technological breakthroughs which had been prompted by the war still being developed and assessed. The new jets were still in their infancy and had, as still relatively experimental aircraft, mostly been ordered in fairly small numbers. Now that changed. They were needed in numbers sufficient to meet war needs, as for the first time, jets were to be deployed in combat on both sides. The war-driven boost to available research funds would see the jet engines advanced radically in design by the end of the conflict, and new generations of planes would ride those developments. However, it was only possible to fight the war with the weapons at hand, and these were a mixed assortment, reflecting the state of transition of aviation in general. For much of the war, the carriers were to remain critical, providing air bases offshore on both sides of the Korean peninsula. Without the air support, it's unlikely that the improvised intervention assembled by MacArthur in Japan would have had time to reinforce the line at Pusan. However, after the North Koreans had been beaten to a halt, there was no longer any real danger of the UN forces being evicted from their foothold. The Navy's planes wrested control of the air in a series of direct and dynamic strokes that effectively wiped out all the Communists' air force. Without any air support, the northern forces, increasingly disorganized, disheartened, and pinned down, lost the initiative completely. The US carriers flew planes that were, in the main, Second World War designs. The Douglas AD Sky Raider attack planes had been developed from a June 1944 design. Delivery had missed the World War, but several hundred of the planes had been made and were in service when the Korean conflict broke out. they were capable of astounding lifting. The plane empty weighed only 10,500 pounds, yet takeoffs with loads of nearly 3 times that were achievable. A plane taking off at 29,000 pounds gross would be carrying around 14,000 pounds of useful load. With an armament mix that included 2 20mm cannon and bombs, rockets or torpedoes, they were a potent and ruggedly built aircraft. They were to remain in use for many years to come. The Sky Raiders were never the only attack plane in the Navy inventory, but for much of their service, and certainly for the 3 years of Korea, they were the main strike plane. From the AD-1 of 1948, generations of improved versions appeared, the last Sky Raiders being AD-7s, delivered in March 1957. 3,180 were built. They were operated from the carriers and from land in Korea, and provided the attacking punch that was needed. In the hodgepodge of Mustangs, Invaders and other worthy leftovers, the Navy planes were very refined specialists. It was the excellence of the close air support from the Marines and the carrier planes, and the carriers' constant disruption of supplies for the North Korean forces that had dominated the battlefield and subdued the opposition. By August, the summer's fighting had completely redressed the stage. Now the communists, exhausted and ill-equipped, faced increasingly strong forces concentrating in the perimeter at Pusan, and additional forces assembling to come to the theatre. The bitterness of the fighting indicated that, despite the growing UN superiority, the cost of reclaiming Korea would be high. MacArthur turned to his experience of amphibious landings and decided to send the Marines ashore at Incheon to cut the North Koreans off. They could then be squeezed between the Pusan forces breaking out and the forces at Incheon breaking in. The landings at Incheon went ahead on the morning of the 15th of September. The operation was outstandingly successful. Incheon is a port city and was well defended, as was the nearby airfield at Kimpo. However, aided by intense pinpoint attack support from the ships and from the carrier planes, the Marines were irresistible and smoothly rolled across the defences, the city falling by midnight on the 15th. Marine losses were only 22 killed, with less than 200 wounded. This was, of course, the war where the jet came of age. The communists were flying limited numbers of the excellent MiG-15s, and these had provided more than a few headaches for the fighter pilots. The majority of carrier-based fighters from 1949 to 1952 were Grumman F-9Fs. Panthers had flown the first Navy jet combat missions over Korea on August the 6th, 1950. The Navy's new generation of planes were to be in the thick of the fighting thereafter. The jet fighters used, the Panthers and McDonnell's Banshees, had both come into service in 1948 and were both to have some difficulty in dealing with the slippery MiGs. Part of the reasoning behind the post-war deactivation of the majority of the US Armed Forces establishment had been the conviction that the arrival of nuclear weapons had meant the end of conventional warfare. However, the Korean conflict was fought without nuclear weapons, as a limited use of force, although the force used was considerable. As the North Koreans struggled to escape the trap closing in on them, they were constantly subject to the shattering attacks of the unrestrained Navy aircraft. The carriers chewed through ordnance at a rapid rate, needing replenishment every third day. The explosive which paralyzed communist activity flowed forward in a conveyor of ships to the planes that delivered them. Practiced and expert seamanship was a large part of the air war. By keeping the carriers on station, this constant logistic operation played a major part in the outcome of the war. The fuels, ammunition, food, mail, bombs and planes were constantly there to keep the war machine's business end functioning smoothly. carrier decks hummed with activity around the clock, with constant patrolling and raids. The deck crews worked their watches tirelessly, maintaining, arming and marshalling the aircraft. The efficiency of these teams was the make or break of a ship's effectiveness, and these ships were outstandingly effective. One weapon used increasingly was napalm. It had first been tried in the Pacific in 1944, and in Korea it was widely employed in tactical support missions. The process of mixing the napalm and loading it into tanks was only semi-effective. A hopper of powdered napalm surmounted a valve into a stream of aviation gas, allowing the powder to mix with the fuel. However, as the fuel was often too cold to gel with the powder, creosote was then added to the mixture as it flowed into the tank. The tanks themselves were thin-skinned to break up on impact, but this also meant that they often leaked, adding to the already numerous hazards of the process. To counter this, the ships stocked chewing gum, which was issued with the tanks and used to plug any holes that showed while the tank was loaded. The justification for all of this dangerous fiddling was, of course, that the weapon was extremely effective. The ground troops were able to call down the sticky fireballs to suppress resistance, rather than having to fight their way across every foot of ground. The communists became increasingly disheartened under the ever more hostile and dangerous sky. Their organization was gone. Increasingly isolated and starved of supplies, the North Korean army started to evaporate. The United Nations forces pushed their way back up the Korean peninsula and over the 38th parallel. The Korean landscape showed the damage of the two waves of war that had swept the country. The northern forces fell back, ever less coordinated, and by October, the predominantly American UN Army was pushing on towards the Manchurian border. In an effort to avoid a confrontation with the Soviets or the Chinese, the United Nations forces were ordered to stay clear of any air or navy action north of the Yalu River, and the command let it be publicly known that these orders were in force. The American troops fighting on the ground were better equipped, trained and led than their opponents, and it seemed that the whole of the North would soon be overrun. Whether this would have meant the reunification of Korea is impossible to tell. The whole face of the war was about to change again. After only 4 months, the battle had seesawed down Korea and back again. Now, with the northern forces disintegrating, the Chinese made their entry into the contest. Large numbers of PLA troops entered the fray. The Chinese government asserted that these were volunteers who had gone unprompted to the aid of their socialist brethren. However, for volunteers off the street, it seems fair to note that there were a lot of them, they were very military in their organization, and they were deploying a large quantity of war-making hardware. At the risk of sounding sarcastic, it's a very well-dressed volunteer indeed who sports a MiG fighter. The MiGs had first appeared on May Day 1949, proudly displayed in Moscow. Initial Western reaction had been patronizing and dismissive of the new Soviet weapon. However, events were to show that, as had been the case with the Japanese Zero fighter, the assessments were wrong. The Russians had produced a plane as good as, if not better than, those arrayed against it. It was basic, light and short-ranged, but it was fast and slippery, and in the hands of a good pilot, it was hard to best. The UN forces slowly fell back before the Chinese, and eventually the battle stabilized just north of the old border, with a developing stalemate that neither side could break. Peace talks began in July 1951 and were to drag on, with interruptions, for 2 years. During this time, the fighting died down, the two sides content to maintain belligerent faces while awaiting the outcome. When the peace talks broke down, fighting restarted. When they were resumed, the uneasy calm returned. Prisoners were exchanged, and more channels of communication were opened. The effort of the communists had really resolved itself as an attempt to save face. China's sole real military asset was the number of soldiers she could deploy. Their equipment was in the main outclassed, in much the same way as the North Koreans. They were, however, better led and organized and maintained their presence and their pressure throughout the remainder of the war. The stalemate was finally ended with the signing of a formal truce on the 27th of July 1953, with the truce line almost exactly where the border had been before the 37 months of war. The airmen of the carrier force received their well-earned decorations. It had been a bitterly fought war, and American casualties had been high, 142,000 killed, wounded, captured or missing. The ships went home and left Korea to resume its uneasy division. As has been the case in most of the United States post-war interventions around the globe, the aircraft carriers were a crucial element. Their constancy, safe from attack and deploying such deadly power, had shielded the concentration of defense and had spearheaded the tide of advance. The many voices which had trumpeted their irrelevance and obsolescence in the nuclear age were severely embarrassed. This claim that the carrier has had its day has found new supporters and new arguments as an almost continuous background noise ever since the Second World War. Without wishing to question the sagacity or the impartiality of those who make these assertions, it's striking that for the last 40 years, each time their voices have reached a crescendo, there's been some event or series of events that's shown the lie to their conviction. In 1950, they were certainly completely wrong. The carrier, as it had been in the Pacific campaigns of the Second World War, had been the key to victory. A Corsair lands, and a loose rocket, live and dangerous, bounces free and skids down the deck. Two men pounce on the lethal object and carry it to the side of the ship to toss it into the sea. This is bravery of a kind rarely noticed or praised. It was the way in which the carriers coped with these moments of drama, as well as the strain of constant, meticulous routine, that ensured their effect and safely supported their domination of the conflict.